What is wrong with men? Here are some facts you might find shocking, or maybe not. According to the CDC, obesity rates for American men today are the highest of all major countries, at over 40%. Testosterone is down 20% compared to 1999. Men make up only 40% of college students and graduate 14% less often. Young men ages 21 to 35 are 60% more likely to be living with their parents. And tragically, men's suicide rates have reached a post-war high, more than 3 times the rate of women. Again, I ask, what is wrong with men? If we reply honestly, the answer might be everything. Boys are struggling too. Parents, it's no longer about your son getting good grades in school. It's about protecting him from video games and pornography, failure to launch, and even gender confusion. And women, I bet you see that the men in your lives are missing something. Some lack vitality and courage. Others lack empathy and depth. Have men always been this way? If only we could make sense of it all. If only someone had answers. My name is Will Spencer. I'm a Stanford graduate, former tech entrepreneur, and world traveler, and I'm the host of the Renaissance of Men podcast. I've been studying this subject for 20 years, and I have some answers. The answer for how we got here, I call the war on masculinity. The answer for what's being done about it, I call the Renaissance of Men. And the answer for what will fix these problems with benefits for men, women, children, and society, I call the Great Reconciliation. Let's begin with the war on masculinity. Our story starts in the past with something called the household, pictured here. This mural inside the United States Department of the Interior depicts the way of life for men, women, and children for centuries. Once upon a time, we weren't all separate. We shared the same space for more than a few hours at the beginning and end of each day. We weren't living disconnected lives, crossing paths at mealtime. A family had one life together. Because the home was the center of economic production, not the office, and the home was the center of education, not the school. And all that changed during the Industrial Revolution. During the Industrial Revolution, for the first time in history, fathers were taken from the home and forced to work in factories or on the railroad, and that shift had consequences. As the poet and author Robert Bly wrote, "The traditional way of raising sons, which lasted for thousands and thousands of years, amounted to fathers and sons living in close, murderously close proximity, while the father taught the son a trade, perhaps farming or carpentry or blacksmithing or tailoring. As I've suggested elsewhere, the love unit most damaged by the Industrial Revolution has been the father-son bond." In that moment, the chain of father and son was broken. This was the beginning. After the Industrial Revolution followed 2 world wars and a Great Depression. In World War I, 10 million soldiers died. That's the population of London today. Then in World War II, 25 million soldiers died. That's the population of Australia. The best and the brightest, the swiftest and the smartest, gone forever. The men who returned were broken in body and in spirit. Winston Churchill wrote of World War I, "The wounded died between the lines, the dead moldered into the soil. Merchant ships and neutral ships and hospital ships were sunk on the seas, and all on board left to their fate, or killed as they swam. Poison gas in many forms stifled or seared the soldiers. Liquid fire was projected upon their bodies. Men fell from the air in flames, or were smothered often slowly in the dark recesses of the sea. Europe and large parts of Asia and Africa became one vast battlefield on which, after years of struggle, not armies but nations broke and ran." This is what happened to Dad when he was taken from the household. This was the story of 2 generations of men. These men also came home to rebuild in the 1950s. They'd experienced the horrors of war. They were wounded, angry, unable to communicate the pain of being shot, of hopelessness and terror, and of grief in the loss of their brothers. John Wayne, the stoic defender, spoke to them, but someone else was speaking to their kids. Because if World War I and II were a war on men's bodies through combat, the 1950s began a war on men's minds through culture. Hugh Hefner started Playboy magazine in 1953. Elvis Presley's hips swung into living room the same decade as Marilyn Monroe sang, "Diamonds are a girl's best friend." The supposedly idyllic 1950s laid the groundwork for the 1960s and the sexual revolution. In the 1960s, sex was catastrophically divorced from fatherhood, and providership was replaced with the pursuit of pleasure. Free love, said the hippies with the pill. Turn on, tune in, drop out, said Timothy Leary with acid. These were precursors to porn and video games today. Meanwhile, the Beatles had young girls longing for rock stars, not husbands. Vietnam sent capable boys overseas to be destroyed. Woodstock played a siren song for draft-dodging sons to enrage their veteran dads. And men were torn apart from each other and their fathers. Then everyone got the message about what happens when you try to stand for something.
This will be the day when
The 1970s introduced Archie Bunker, the bigoted dad who confirmed men's worst fears about fatherhood. Rock stardom offered another path before disco took over, and pornography was normalized with John Holmes and The Devil and Miss Jones. And in the 1980s, the media announced new expectations for masculinity for boomers becoming parents themselves. Androgynous rock stars, steroid super soldiers, and corporate raiders.
Greed, for lack of a better word, is good. Greed is right. Greed works.
These represent aspects of men: strength, skill, courage, and vision, but they're not fathers. This isn't a coincidence. The first no-fault divorce law was signed in 1969, skyrocketing the rates of single motherhood. And we, as a culture, began to forget what fathers were for. Which explains why Married with Children, Homer Simpson, and Tim the Toolman Taylor made Dad into a clown. So arriving at the end of the century, the greatest generation of men had broken bodies, baby boomer men had warped minds, and the last phase of the war on masculinity began, waged against Generation X and millennials through politics, which is a war on men's hearts. A political commentator once said, "Politics is downstream from culture." So after decades of cultural war against masculinity, our politics shifted too. The 1990s started the process, with Bill Clinton, Monica Lewinsky, and the increasing prevalence of sex scandals, and also the Clarence Thomas affair, a precursor to Brett Kavanaugh. And in the past 2 decades, we've seen the introduction of the phrase toxic masculinity, Hannah Rosin's Atlantic article, The End of Men, which became a best-selling book, the destruction of movie heroes like Luke Skywalker and Thor, Princess Meghan taking the driver's seat over Prince Harry, the #MeToo movement, and finally transgenderism, the promotion of gender confusion, and more. All these phenomena are related. Feminism's attempts to elevate women at the expense of men played a role, but the assault on men is much more complicated. Men and boys are failing today because our culture shames them at every turn and has been building to this for a century. First, the war on masculinity broke the bodies of men from the greatest generation. Then it sold baby boomer men pleasure instead of honor in a family. And finally, it called Gen X and millennial men toxic and said women, their sole partners on earth, no longer needed them. This broke men's hearts. If you can break men's hearts, you can get men to kill themselves rather than killing them. You can get boys to cut off the thing that makes them a man before they can become one. You can get men to boast and swagger like they're invincible so they don't have to show emotion over any of it. And you can make manhood seem so terrifying and shameful, a boy will stay in his parents' basement forever. This is the war on masculinity. It's been waged for 150 years. Men today are casualties of war. That is why everything is wrong. But something is being done about it. I'd like to introduce you to the Renaissance of Men, which is the title of my podcast, and more. The Renaissance of Men is a worldwide process to redeem masculinity to meet the demands of our declining world. I didn't start it, I just observed it and gave it a name. Because you might be surprised to learn the Renaissance of Men started 40 years ago. Since then, it's progressed in stages as men have tried to address the challenges of masculinity using different tools, each stage learning something along the way. We begin in the 1980s. 40 years ago, authors like Robert Bly, Douglas Gillette, and others observed the beginnings of men's decline and decided that men needed a return to wildness. So they led men into the forest to build bonds of brotherhood through rites of passage. In the show A Gathering of Men, which premiered in 1990, the renowned journalist Bill Moyers interviewed Robert Bly about his ideas.
All I know of the troubadours, I bring to this bed.
The VHS tape, shipped through the mail, became a national bestseller. Meanwhile, Dr. Warren Farrell, a former leading feminist, wrote best-selling books entitled Why Men Are the Way They Are and The Myth of Male Power. He appeared on Oprah and in publications worldwide. And the Christian men's organization, the Promise Keepers, filled stadiums and held a rally in Washington, D.C. that attracted 800,000 men. Before the internet, men and women were thirsting for a revival of masculinity. Then the New York Times said Robert Bly was promoting narcissism. Men's initiations were ridiculed as naked drumming in the forest, and the Promise Keepers were accused of sexism, racism, and more. So the book stopped selling, the forests fell silent, and the stadiums emptied. The first wave was over, but a beachhead had been established. Then, in the late 1990s, men in Los Angeles gathered in bars and nightclubs attempting an experiment. They wanted to see if there was more to getting laid than getting lucky. They were led by Eric von Markovic, aka Mystery. He had conversation techniques he called game that were successful at generating one-night stands. And thousands of young men from divorced families and deprived of fathers followed Mystery into the clubs, chasing validation from women through sex. This wave spawned best-selling books, including The Game by the Rolling Stone journalist and Mystery disciple Neil Strauss, who even tried game on Jessica Alba on a late-night talk show. And Mystery had his own reality TV show on VH1 as well. But behind the scenes, these men were a mess. They had trouble forming long-term relationships and holding down jobs. Robert Bly's wildness wasn't the answer, and neither was Mystery's promise of casual sex. But men had advanced from the beachhead into culture. The next wave asked, if we can have success with women by pretending to be high-value men, what if we became high-value men? And with the invention of social media, men gathered online to do just that. On sites like Reddit, men challenged each other to improve their fitness and personal finances, upgrading their romantic options without playing games. And as men rediscovered their capacity for brotherhood and transformation, they began wondering, is masculinity really toxic? Could men even be good? Jack Donovan in his classic The Way of Men said yes. Rollo Tomasi's cult hit The Rational Male explained why men believed otherwise, and YouTube channels, blogs, and content creators proliferated to help men down the path. Robert Bly's wildness didn't work, but he demonstrated that men needed each other. Mystery's hedonism didn't work, but he demonstrated that motivated men can take control of their lives. With these data points and the internet, men began to transform themselves in remarkable ways. This also benefited men trampled by divorce. They rallied around leaders like Paul Elam, featured in the hit documentary The Red Pill, who gave men a sense of belonging in their isolation. Something big was taking shape, but a piece was missing: fatherhood. A man can have a great body and checking account and all the dates he can handle, but he can stay immature forever without a family to grow him up. And as the curtain of COVID descended, another wave rediscovered the blessings of family, home, and sovereignty. Ryan Mickler from the Order of Man amassed a gigantic following with one of the top podcasts in the world. Strongman and father of 4, Elliot Hulse, attracted millions of subscribers on YouTube. Tanner Guzzi promoted intentional fathering in a groundbreaking TEDx talk. Pete Roberts partnered with former Navy SEAL Jocko Willink to bring manufacturing back to rural America. And gym owner Ian Smith showed America what it meant to stand up to tyranny.
And my partner and I are not willing to back down. We're not going to have our lives destroyed over a political agenda that has nothing to do with us.
After 40 years, the Renaissance was making an impact, and not a moment too soon. But there was one last step to take: faith. Inspired by the massive success of Dr. Jordan Peterson, Bishop Robert Barron, and Pastor Doug Wilson, among others, men began to rediscover Christianity, the faith of their fathers. In doing so, they grasped the meaning of fatherhood, family, and love, because at last there was room for women. Previous stages of the Renaissance were reactionary. They ignored women, as Robert Bly did, treated women as conquests like Mystery did, or blamed women for everything like men on Reddit did. But men of faith recognized that without women, it's pointless. Not because men need women to produce a family, but because men and women need each other. And besides, life is better together. So, the war on masculinity got us here. The Renaissance of men was the response, but the Great Reconciliation is our destination. Fathers need mothers, wives need husbands, children need parents. We all need each other. But most importantly, our sons need an image of something positive to become, a noble goal to strive for, to give their lives purpose and direction. Because nothing calls a boy to adventure like the love and admiration of a woman, and nothing grows a man into a hero like the gifts of fatherhood, brotherhood, and faith. At the start of this video, I asked, what is wrong with men? The real answer is that 150 years ago, we took from men the image of the only thing they ever wanted. Then they lost the memory that they ever had it. What if we brought that image back? Might we get our men back? Might we get our boys back? If you're wondering why this matters, here's why. This was me in 2012. I was 50 pounds heavier, in a dead-end relationship, going nowhere fast with Peter Pan dreams. Then I discovered Robert Bly and set out on an epic journey. I transformed my life because I discovered brotherhood, adventure, faith, and a reason to live, not just be alive. I discovered the Renaissance of men happening all around us for decades. This discovery changed my life, and I believe it can change the lives of men around the world, which is why in summer 2021, I set off on a cross-country road trip to produce a documentary series about the Renaissance of men. I traveled for 110 days from California to Maine and back, driving 14,000 miles. I conducted 25 interviews with major leaders of the Renaissance like Ryan Michler, Jack Donovan, Pete Roberts, Allison Armstrong, Rollo Tomasi, Elliot Hulse, Ian Smith, and many more. They let me into their homes, their families, and even their gyms. I filmed 60 hours of 4K footage, including never-before-seen interviews, B-roll, drone photography, and more. We laughed and cried together. Once I saw that war was being waged on masculinity, I decided it was time for a counteroffensive. Not because anyone asked me to, but because for decades, men have allowed culture to be defined for us. That is done through art, which is the battlefield of culture. Men have withdrawn from that battlefield while building businesses and providing for their families. But the void left behind has been filled by people who despise men, women, children, and intact families. And their messages have dominated TV and movies, entertainment, and politics. I was a casualty of their war, which is why as soon as I could stand, I picked up a sword and a camera, and I need your help. The success of Top Gun Maverick and Yellowstone demonstrates the demand for masculine heroes, but Tom Cruise and Kevin Costner have been with us for decades. Their star power can push those projects through on their terms. Once those Hollywood legends are gone, who'll be left? Which is why my goal is to re-inspire our vision of masculinity and fatherhood, not with fiction, but with truth. Not taking us back to the 1950s, the age of our battle-scarred grandfathers. Those men deserve our sympathy and our gratitude. But respectfully, men today have tools they didn't. Accountability through brotherhood, countless books and videos, online communities, role models, and a reinvigorated church. Plus, feminism reminds us every day of men's sins of the past, but men have endured those sins too. Women are not the only victims of absent and abusive fathers, and men of my generation are not anxious to repeat those mistakes. We are ready to try again, anew. This isn't a revolution. A revolution goes around and around. It's not a reformation. There's no leader dictating anything from the top down. It's a restoration, a remembering, a rebirth. I call it a renaissance. Through this rebirth, we will redeem masculinity for a world that desperately needs it. Because the pendulum has swung too far to one side, and there are signs of a reaction building, we have a chance to stop the pendulum in the middle, to stop an overcorrection, and bring men, women, and children together for the future of our nation and our world. If you're concerned about the state of men today, I can help. These are my answers, and they're good ones. They've changed my life. They can change your life. They can change your husband or boyfriend's life. And I believe they can even change your son's life, and maybe your daughter's too. But I need your help. This train has left the station. This project is not a pipe dream. It is happening. Contact me at film@renofmen.com if you'd like to be a part of it. And welcome to the Renaissance of Men. You are the Renaissance. Thank you.